the engineers really have to understand the real world problems. What I'm seeing at Rippling too is, suddenly product managers can also write code, designers can write code.
So developers are no longer the custodian of code.
At one point, our single heaviest user of Cursor was a intern in Bangalore. Engineers using like transcription tools, like Whisper Flow is an example. Like they don't even touch the keyboard anymore. They just talk to the computer. The computer, writes the code, and so.
So most of the new age technologies generally always emerge from the universities.
But something we're really excited about is harnessing the coding agents, like in the Rippling context, with access to Rippling specific tools.
Hello everyone, welcome to the new episode of ScalerPod. I have Albert with me, CTO at Rippling, and we are going to talk about the software engineering in the post-AI world and how Rippling builds the compound startup, which a monolithic tech stack that builds multiple applications, full-fledged applications for end-to-end lifecycle of employee onboarding. We'll talk about how Rippling nurtures the talent, what kind of talent they seek, and how the journey has been. Welcome, Albert. Welcome to ScalerPod.
Thank you, Avi. Excited to be here.
Fantastic. Albert, so I think in most of my conversations with engineers or even aspiring engineers who are still in the university, the biggest question in the mind is that in a world where machine can output code at a speed which no human can match, how does the career as a software engineer itself evolve, or the nature of work itself is changing a lot with all these AI tools? What have been your observations that how has engineering at Rippling has evolved over time? And as you are looking to get new talent in your ecosystem, how do you look at talent? What is the real capabilities in the new world?
Yes. Yeah, it is definitely an exciting time. I think maybe also a confusing time to be a software engineer or somebody studying to be a software engineer right now. And in terms of the evolution, if you look back at Rippling's history, I mean even pre-AI, I think one of the key things with the early team was really an expectation that the engineers, would also think about the product. As Parker, our CEO, and Prasanna, our co-founder, CTO, as they were building the team, like that was very much the expectation. There weren't actually a lot of product managers at the company in the early days, and so engineers were PMs, engineers were designers. Like that was the early approach. And I think that's really important when you're dealing with, complex, real world issues where you're trying to put a software abstraction layer over it. Like the engineers really have to understand the real world problems. Right. And so, to some extent, Rippling had a bit of this, like truly full stack engineering
from pretty early
already.
On.
Yeah, from pretty early on. Yeah. What I think is happening with the AI tools now, though, is, almost like any engineer is freed up from a lot of this mechanical work, right? And I think really where the industry is going is, an expectation that any engineer is able to play, part-time product manager, part-time designer, part-time, even customer support specialist, I guess, because less time is being consumed by writing code. And so there, I think the expectations are shifting, and at the same time, what I'm seeing at Rippling too is, suddenly product managers can also write code, designers can write code. Yesterday, our chief operating officer and chief product officer, Matt McGinnis, he was asking me for a Cursor license because he wanted to fix some stuff in the code. So at the same time, like the engineering expectation is full stack, but also engineers will be joined by other stakeholders across the business
Right.
that maybe didn't write code historically, but are
Right.
now starting to write code. So
So
uh,
developers are no longer the custodian of code, because now earlier, even just
exactly,
to change a little thing, you will always have to go to a developer.
exactly.
But it's no more. It's kind of more
Yeah, it's
level
it's
playing
much
field.
more it's much
Yeah.
more fluid, and
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah.
a challenge, of course, as you're coming up in your career, is figuring out how to operate in that kind of environment where,
Right.
I think thinking about my internship or internships I did, was like early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
If I think about the like projects I did as an intern,
Mm-hmm.
like that is a prompt and like 10 seconds for
Yes.
Opus 4.5 now,
Right.
right? It's things that took me a week
Right.
or two to
Right.
complete. It's
Right.
now like that, and
Right.
so you're just doing very different engineering work.
Right. Right.
Like looking at it.
One philosophy that a lot of and pretty intelligent folks on Twitter, etc., they talk about that in the post AI world, at least there are a little bit of early signs of a certain K-shaped divergence in the talent pool,
Hmm.
that people who are fairly experienced are really good at system architecture, understood product cycles, product nuances well. Their demand is rising,
Hmm.
while at the same time at entry level, as you rightly said, right, that a lot of work that we did as intern when we were coding
Yes.
15-20 years back, that could be just a prompt now
Hmm.
to Claude Code, right? And hence the argument some people say is that the entry level jobs, interns, etc., might just become obsolete and irrelevant. But your actions at Rippling are kind of opposite to that. We were just talking that you just onboarded some 50 or 60 interns. Next year you plan to onboard more.
Yes.
uh, Help us understand the why behind that.
Yeah.
That even in the post AI world, you're doubling down on getting super intelligent, hardworking interns. What is your bet?
Yeah, I think as you said, we have expanded, in India and in the US, the scale of the internship program pretty
Yeah.
significantly over the last few years. Um, Probably this year like 70 interns or so in
Mm-hmm.
India, and roughly an equal number in the US. Across a summer and a winter class. Um, my main bet there is, you know as you said, some of the senior talent is in very high demand, but at the same time, fresh thinking, fresh ideas, fresh approaches to problem solving that somewhat natively incorporates these AI tools.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm seeing that coming from the interns and the new grads.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about rippling over the last 12 months, at one point our single heaviest user of Cursor was a intern in Bangalore, and she was doing some kind of massive
Right.
migration in the code base, and
Yeah.
so as we were looking at the dashboards, we're like, wow, an intern is number one, and
Right.
and that really cemented for me this idea that these up and coming engineers will to some extent play a leading role in changing how we engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And they also place new demands on our developer like
Right.
infrastructure,
Right.
right? As you think about builds and tests and
Right.
documentation and like tools you provide to developers, these kind of like AI native developers need
Right.
something like quite different from what you maybe had a couple of years ago, and so you really want to push those folks like into the
Right.
organization to some extent like force you to come up with solutions for all of those issues.
Right.
The reality, for example, is like the amount of code that humans can review relative to the amount of code being created. Like there's only so many hours in a day. Humans can only go so deep. Like you're gonna have to come up
Right.
with new approaches to code review,
Yeah.
to deployment, to
Yeah.
rollback. When you have this army of eager young
Right.
engineers that
Right.
want to build products and push things out quickly, and
Right.
so I want that energy at the company,
Makes sense.
and then it creates some problems to some extent, but like you want to deal with that because it
Yeah.
makes the team stronger and makes
Yeah.
the
No, I
kind of
think
like
there is
developer
this.
process
Yeah,
stronger.
no, that's a very interesting point. That is it fair to kind of, if I extend this a little bit, that do you see that a young engineer who is maybe just 19, 20-year old, is the probability of them adopting a new way of doing things is higher than someone who is already accustomed to old way of doing things?
Yeah.
And have you seen this a bit already? Or
I think absolutely. I do think the AI tooling kind of like went through a few waves where, you know, I'd say probably like late 2024, early 2025, that was where early adopters and interns like these folks were really pushing the tools. I think at this point, probably like most engineers at Rippling that I would consider established in their careers, they have become AI built. They got the memo. Everybody has a favorite between Claude Code and Cursor and Open Code and Codex and all of these tools. So it's not so much a 0 or 1 like AI or not AI anymore, but I still think some of the up and coming engineers are the ones that most expansively like use the tools for approximately everything. And they're almost like the most impatient, right? Like where someone that's been doing it for a while has some muscle memory about still editing code by hand. Like what you see with some of the new folks is it doesn't even occur to them that they would painstakingly type on a keyboard. What I love to see is engineers using like transcription tools, like Whisper Flow is an example. Like they don't even touch the keyboard anymore. They just talk to the computer. The computer writes the code. And so I think you see those kinds of approaches with if you don't know anything else, like you're gonna do whatever feels the fastest. And so that's maybe the difference between established folks and folks new in
and
their
rightly
career.
said. So most of the new age technology is generally always emerged from the universities. Like Facebook, for example, first went popular inside university campuses before becoming a global platform. Snapchat, and same applies to technology as well. The younger ones are the ones who are generally early adopters of the technology before rest of the world follow.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a challenge and I mean, I'm very curious to hear how you guys are thinking about it at Skylar, but it is I imagine a challenge for universities right now to keep up with the rate of change in industry. I mean, it has historically been an issue, right? Like the curriculum is the thing the industry needed 3 years ago, but right now I imagine the curriculum is the thing the industry needed, like even it's even more outdated essentially. And so you need a very dynamic kind of like approach to education to keep up with what's happening in the world.
I think that's a very interesting question, and of course, given how passionate you are about grooming the young talent to be really productive for the industry, and of course at Scalar, our core belief is that a curriculum is not supposed to be something written in stone. It is first as a framework. You have to allow it to be a living document rather than something set in stone that only gets changed a few times a year, but rather probably it need a reiteration every 6 months. And second thing that we try to do is that instead of even us being the author of curriculum, the key is, while to be candid, to some extent no one knows where the future is, but people who are at least watching it from the edge as close as possible are people like you. People who are building the products in the industry, and giving the authorship to them, I think, is the key way to solve it, at least to the highest accuracy possible. So I think fast iterations and getting the builders of the top startups, the top companies, giving them authorship solves it to some extent. I would still say that this is one of the hardest problems.
Yes.
But that is how we try to solve it. And if I just kind of flip that question over to you, so for example, we have University of Waterloo, which have interesting approach to mix co-ops into the curriculum. On the other side, as industry, Rippling, for example, is creating these internship programs where during the degree itself, students get an opportunity to learn. And I would argue that there is no better way to learn than actually see the real world, and kind of in not just in a theoretical way, but in a very practical way, be responsible for the code that you put on production. Because no matter what a university does, it is impossible for a university to have a platform like Rippling where students can build something and deploy on that and take ownership for the positive impact or something breaking both, right? If you were to design, let's say if you were building University of Waterloo all over again in 2026, and then the problem you have to solve is that 2030, by the time this 18-year-old is going to graduate,
Yes.
what would really make them relevant for the world as it would be in 2030? And of course, it's very difficult to accurately predict what even world would be like in 2030. But how would you look at this problem?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as you said, looking at our US intern program, we are very fond of the University of Waterloo interns, and there's a couple of other schools as well. And really, what they emphasize, I mean, as do you guys, is multiple internships, over the course of the 3 or 4 year degree. And thinking also about my own career. I interned on and off for 5 or 6 years as I was doing my bachelor's degrees. Like that opportunity to learn a little bit, then apply it in industry, learn a little bit, apply it in industry. Like I think is really important to developing a very strong software engineer. And so thinking about what does the ideal program look like, I do think an emphasis on some theoretical learning, some algorithms, some computer science fundamentals, like certainly important. Some of this like first principles thinking around how to write software, how computers work, has to be emphasized. I do think thinking about the AI future, like there is still a role to play when it comes to systems design for the human, and you really need to critique the output of these models and agents. I think especially as the output increases and the complexity of the systems increases, there's still room for taste and experience. And so a lot of that comes from the fundamentals, like really understanding the core systems. But then I think the other key part, as you said, is building in the industry, like really being exposed to messy real world problems and struggling with turning some kind of problem and then a solution into working software. And I also think what's really important is like seeing that software in the hands of users, thinking beyond databases and backend systems, thinking about user experience, thinking about design, like getting some repetition, some reps, just like taking software to customers, taking it to users is really important. I think that's quite hard to achieve in a purely academic setting. And thinking back to the early engineers at Rippling, that is exactly what the engineering team did even before they were product managers. Is they built the software, they shipped it to customers, they saw how it worked. And so I think a balance between those two is really important. The other challenge, of course, is I don't even I struggle to conceive of what 2030 is going to hold exactly. I imagine, already the mechanical work of software engineering feels like it's rapidly diminishing, but I imagine it will almost be gone, right? A lot of like debugging of like thorny little systems issues, a lot of like triage of systems problems during a a production incident. Like I think a lot of that stuff goes away, but I think the kind of like larger scale strategic system design element remains, obviously aided by AI. And I think probably the thing that will still be true in 2030, even with very powerful models, and Elon is going to put data centers in space. We're going to have infinite GPUs by then, maybe.
K2 scale. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I still think there's going to be a human in the loop workflow when it comes to designing products, designing the systems, and steering this like very powerful AI capability. And so, thinking about programs, they have to emphasize this steering, or, I really think of it as maybe like placing constraints on the models, as you go forward and, write your implementation plan, or, write your prompt. You really have to think about how you steer the model, or I would call it like aiming the laser, right? You have to figure out what you're aiming the laser at before you pull the trigger. And so I think emphasizing that kind of critical thinking, requirements gathering, like that is going to be
So there's this
stuff that doesn't go out of style.
So to interrupt you, there's this discipline called design thinking and critical thinking. Do you think those capabilities will gain more weightage in future than just the raw ability to write good code?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, even now, just from speaking from personal experience, the models are not perfect yet, but like they are writing very good code already.
They write better code than me.
Yeah, they certainly write it faster. They probably write it better. They're also very patient when it comes to creating tests or working through issues. So I think a lot of that stuff goes by the wayside. And as you said, like this critical thinking, thinking like the customer, thinking from the perspective of the product manager, the designer, thinking about how will you support the software in the real world, thinking about long-term maintenance. Like these are all things that maybe historically an early in career engineer did not have to load onto their plate. Like this will be the job in the future. And so again, I think training, learning about that, training about it, talking about it, in a classroom setting, and in an internship or in a early job is going to be really important.
Right. No, that's very interesting, because when I look at the computer science education as of today, now while these are in theory some little part of the curriculum, but this is not really currently, like the critical thinking, design thinking is not seen as the one heavy part.
Yes.
Today a CS graduate, if they are good at say algorithms, they know the networking operating system really well, that's considered a good graduate. Now, as you earlier talked about, that these fundamentals would remain, but strong capability building on critical thinking, being able to think of different scenarios that can pan out in future, and getting AI to do that, I think that will probably in a 2030, someone who's graduating in 2030, in your view, that would look like someone who really creates a lot of value when they are graduating.
Yeah, I think it's basically going to be essential. And the way I think about it too is, if you as a upcoming software engineer doesn't figure that out, like you have to realize the competition, everybody else trying to apply their trade as a software engineer, like they are certainly going to be incentivized to do this, right? This is how you will build the next wave of startups. Teams are going to be smaller, leaner. The competition essentially is definitely going to be doing this. And so if you want to compete, if you want to rise up in the job markets, I feel like you have to figure this out.
No, fantastic. I think obviously Rippling is a great place for a engineer who is high performance. Of course, your talent hiring bar has been super high and leading to a really, like for example in Bangalore or even globally, Rippling's tech team has been a team that all of us look up to, a high talent density. So not just interns, even at senior levels, I think this is a great place to be at. And with that, I would love to now double click on what does Rippling do, right? Now, of course, I'm sure most people know Rippling, but by the nature of, because it is not a consumer company, it's an enterprise company. So while people know it for engineering prowess, high talent density, but let's double click on that, the products that Rippling built and the complexity behind it. In one of my earlier conversation with Prasanna, for example, he talked about that how some of the theoretically not best design decisions, but that work better. So would love to maybe have you tell us how this entire system is architected, what are the design choices, which could even be non-intuitive, but led to positive impact.
So Rippling, if for folks that are not familiar, at a high level, we are a all-in-one solution for businesses. I mean, historically largely based in the US, but we're expanding globally now. that need to solve, issues around HR, IT, finance, payroll, and more recently also a whole set of like business data management capabilities. So, I would think of it as, one part of it is like full employee life cycle. So recruiting, hiring, as you hired a person, sending them a laptop, onboarding them onto the company, managing their access to the tools they need, things like surveys, other parts of talent management like, performance reviews, and then, offboarding, if somebody leaves the company, getting the laptop back, and then other like key parts of running a business as well. So we have a spend management suite, so corporate cards, expenses, bill pay, like the whole procurement process, and some other aspects of IT management as well. So really, meant to do it all.
So it's a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a
right?
lot
And
of
it's very
things.
complex, a lot of compliances, and no room for error.
Exactly.
Right.
No room for error. Very complex. Um, especially, I mean, again, true, across the world, but especially in the US when it comes to, onboarding, getting people paid on time, offboarding, very complex environment. The US obviously has, the federal government, they have a bunch of rules about who gets paid what, when, taxes at the federal level. There's taxes at the state level. There's taxes at the county level. If you live in New York City, there's special taxes, etc. So making sure for businesses that all of that is calculated accurately. Money is remitted to the various federal, state, and local agencies. Helping employees file their taxes across various countries. A lot of US, but also do Canada, UK, Australia, and a number of others. And then I guess a little different between the US and India. Thinking about public healthcare. In the US, a very complex and somewhat antiquated like healthcare benefits environment. Lots of companies that need to be interacted with, lots of complexity when it comes to providing health insurance to your employees. Rippling takes care of all of that.
Very interesting.
So and that's really where we go from pure software platform to software plus real world solutions.
Right.
And so you can do a lot of what I just described purely with software, but for solving this problem fully, there's some of these like last mile interactions where you still sometimes need a human to pick up a phone to somebody at a tax agency or somebody at a insurance provider and solve some kind of problem. And so a big part of what we build is that complete solution that involves when you have a human in the loop. And we obviously try and automate as much of that away as possible. And for our internal teams, we try and give them a lot of tools to streamline this kind of like last mile of effort. But it is, I think, pretty fundamental to a full solution in this space is like you need to have a few humans in the loop that help the companies and help the admins at the companies like get all of the kind of like undifferentiated heavy lifting done. So the software does all of that and more.
So it's, as I can understand, it's a lot of things, and each with a lot of complexity. And as you expand geography wise, the complexity dimension gets added further. So for example, the list of compliances that US might have, and then the list of compliances that UK might have, and then what India might have, it might require a certain different kind of processes, systems to exist. First question I would have is that over your time, that you have spent at Rippling, is your roadmap pretty well defined already? Because what all needs to be built, there's certain visibility you would have in that, and you will architect systems factoring that in. Or is it evolving that maybe what all you might have to get built, you don't know today, 1 year down the line, what you have to build? And first, do you even have to handle that ambiguity? And if yes, then how do you handle that ambiguity? because like for example the data models, right? And sure, UI sometimes often, like it's a common adage that your data model in a way dictates how you would be able to evolve.
Mhm.
So would love you to kind of drill down a little bit on that. How much predictability in the features to build do you even have? uh, and beyond that, how do you make sure that the systems are architected in a way that they can handle that ambiguity as systems evolve?
Great question. Yeah. So I would say at a high level, thinking, about the US and then the international expansion, and, and thinking about core systems like, the HCM stack, payroll, etc. Like there is a lot of like foundational platform capabilities that you can generally apply across, different geographies, different sizes of companies, etc. But and that is, you were asking earlier about the somewhat monolithic nature of the application.
Yeah.
Like that is where we've built a single platform, a big single code base, a whole set of data models to capture all of that kind of like common detail. And then beyond that, there's a lot of I'd call it like the last 20%, like customization, not manual, but kind of like built into the product for different geographies, or different sizes of companies, giving them different capabilities. And so in that sense, there's a lot of things common, in a kind of like a platform structure, but there's a lot of little asterisks that come up, as you move into a new country or you contemplate a different size of customer. So the sorry, what was the second part of the question?
So how do you plan for the ambiguity?
Yes.
Yeah. How do you architect the system?
Yeah, and like the roadmap. Yeah. Thinking about the roadmap, I would say probably at any given time about 60-70% of it is reasonably clear, right? So we have about 30,000 companies on the platform today. Well north of 1 million employees, and so we can see where these companies are going, right? A lot of what they need is determined by their growth. A lot of our roadmap is determined, or like a decent amount of our roadmap is determined by large companies on the platform. They are going public, they're IPOing. That implies certain functionality has to be ready for them, or they're expanding into new geographies. So customers dictate some part of the roadmap. We run rippling on rippling, and so we're somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people right now. It's honestly hard to keep track. Some of the roadmap is actually determined by our own needs, and I think it's actually a great like feature of working at the company is getting to run the business using the software. Like sometimes it can be hard to know what customers think. Like for me to know what a customer thinks, I can sometimes just look in the mirror, because we use the software heavily internally. So I think that's another part of it. So customers give us some direction. We through our own use get some direction, and there's just like strategically, and a lot of this comes from Parker's vision as well. We kind of know where we need to take it. In many of these product verticals, we're not necessarily the first solution that has ever existed, right? There are other solutions out there, but they might be more fragmented, or they don't hang together in a cohesive manner. And so there, our opportunity is just to build it all into the same platform, make all of the different applications work together better. And that's probably like another part of the forces that dictate the roadmap. Is we can see what other software is out there, and we can build the rippling version of it, and make sure it integrates with the whole platform. So like I would say, like obviously not perfect clarity, but like reasonable clarity on where we need to take the business. And the big leadership challenge is actually just figuring out in what order do you build it. We have a very large engineering team. There's 1,100 engineers right now, but we still don't have enough. And so inevitably you have to figure out like, hey, what are we building first, trading off
Mhm.
customer needs versus other strategic
Mhm.
opportunities by expanding into a new product area or whatever. So that's where a lot of the hard work comes in. It's just
Right.
we know everything we should build, but we don't know exactly in what order. And so
Makes
on a
sense.
monthly or quarterly basis, we're tweaking
Mhm.
the sequence.
Got it. And now within your tech stack, there are three elements to it. One is the data model layer, then there is the business logic layer, and then there is the UI part of it, right?
Mhm.
Where do you think you see the highest risk of brittleness getting introduced on the journey? Amongst these three, if you have to care about just one, what would that be and why, and how do you make sure that
Yeah.
it never becomes brittle?
Yeah, great question. I read this blog post recently about a investor. I think his name's Matt Brown at a firm called Matrix
I think from
Partners.
Mattress Partner.
Yeah, and the title of his post was "Your Data Model is Your Destiny," and I remember reading this and feeling very seen. I'm like, wow, it feels like Matt Brown somehow understands rippling and understands the challenges we're facing. And what he really means by data model is not just the foundational like database infrastructure, is it Mongo or Postgres or how you structure the tables or whatever, but it's really the higher level like model of the real world problem domain or business domain. And it's to some extent like how your product thinks about the world that you are encoding there. I think that is for us, the big challenge, as we build new products, is like getting the data model right. And I think the reflecting on the journey of the company and like my 3.5 years, like we get it right a lot, but not always. And a lot of the pain comes from data modeling with what at the time, and then new use cases come up later, and you realize like, hey, the data model is not expressive enough or broad enough to express this new concept. An example of this in Rippling's case is we have the concept of a PEO and an EOR. These are essentially companies that employ people on behalf of other companies. It's companies inside of companies, and these new concepts, like very very good business for us. Like adding this capability of nested companies actually put a lot of strain on our data model, as we were introducing these features over the last couple of years, and it required a lot of creativity. And to some extent, we're still metabolizing some of those changes. Right? It's like it's not always easy to adapt a big system with an established data model to support this kind of new concept. And so that's where as you build this kind of compound startup, you really have to spend a lot of time thinking about what could be. Right? It's like you have to anticipate that employees could have full-time roles and part-time roles and work as a contractor across multiple companies. Companies could be nested inside of one another. Companies can be made up out of multiple entities and a whole slew of other complexity. And so getting that kind of modeling right is really the challenge with this kind of business software.
Indeed. I remember reading this interesting quote that said, in context of a startup, that your data model shows how you see the world.
Exactly.
Right? Because how you are defining those entities, how you are establishing, and in one way, uh, what most startups are doing is, in a way, abstracting real world through your models, right? Um, and if I draw a parallel between, for example, it's very easy to, for even a layman, to understand that in context of a DoorDash or Uber, or even for the India in Zomato, etc., that exactly how Zomato is abstracting this messy real world, let's say, or DoorDash, that I order food. Now my food delivery itself is a data representation in their system, and the person who is delivering my food is another representation in the data system. And between me, the delivery person, and the food person, there's a certain relationship which is evolving with time, right? How do you now, when we shift that from a consumer application like DoorDash or Zomato to an enterprise applications like Rippling. Uh, how do you see this abstraction of the messy real world exploding or getting simplified? What would you see as that in an environment at Rippling are much more complex problems than a simplified consumer application?
Yeah. Now, I will say the consumer applications are sometimes more
More
complex
maybe?
than
Yeah,
one
sure.
gives them credit for.
Yeah.
We actually have quite a few former DoorDash
Mhm,
engineers
mhm.
at Rippling, and so over the years we've talked a lot about, for example, the menu system.
Yeah.
So like the model around capturing menus at restaurants is remarkably complex.
I can
Part of
imagine.
that
Yeah.
problem, I imagine.
And actually,
Zomato.
superficially, it seems like a very simple problem.
Yeah, you're just like, hey, there's
But
some
yeah,
menus,
sure, we
right?
just
But
have
it's
to,
menus change,
yeah.
menus get outdated, like
And there's
I
different customizations in the
yeah,
menus are made
exactly.
with there. And
So in that sense, that even the B2C space is
Mhm.
quite complex.
Yeah.
I think for us the sorry,
So the complexity in abstraction
yeah
at Rippling,
yeah
what are the interesting complexities
the
that
interesting
exist, and how do you all address them?
So maybe comparing Rippling then, like for us a lot of the complexity comes from I'd say like regulation or rules
Mhm.
related to who can be employed, when they need to be paid, how much they need to be paid, and then frequently like who else needs to be paid, right? Government agencies, collecting taxes, etc. Like that's one part of the challenge,
Yeah.
and the important thing too is like none of that is static. Like
The
governments,
policies change, the
agencies,
taxation rules
yeah, the
change. Yeah.
taxation rules change,
Yeah.
policies change. There's not always even much heads up on that stuff. You look at the Trump administration, they have made a bunch of changes like very quickly that leads to changes in the software being required when it comes to taxation.
Right.
So I think that's like one key thing, and there's a
It's
lot of
just sorry to interrupting you, but I think this is a very interesting observation,
yeah.
which often would not be visible. That one new announcement for the government, and that might mean a heavy stress on your tech and product team for the coming weeks. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's kind of like multiple stresses too.
Yeah.
So for example, we have a number of people that work in tax compliance,
Mhm.
and so their first job, as an announcement like this comes out, is reading the regulation and like
Yeah.
giving the product managers and engineers an opinion about what it all means. And then you have to go work through a bunch of potential scenarios, looking at
Yeah.
customers and
Yeah.
employees you might already have on the platform, like
Yeah.
how would it impact them, and then turning this change in regulation into software.
Yeah.
Like a lot of that is a big challenge, and sometimes it has to happen on pretty short notice as
Yeah.
well. You have to taste it. Frequently, some amount of it has to show up in a user interface as well.
Yeah.
An example from the last couple of months in the US is a regulation called no tax on tips.
Mhm.
It has implications for the tax filing and like a number we have to report to customers. So a lot of complexity
Right.
there. And then I would say like another frequent source is just like all things international.
Mhm.
Like these the way this all works is very different from country to country.
Right.
And in certain countries, let's say somebody leaves the company, you have to pay them within the next 24 hours. In other places you can pay them at the end of the month. There's all kinds of details like that you have to get right, so that the company using your software platform is compliant with the local laws or regulations.
So keeping up with the changing regulations, be it taxation, HR policies, etc. Curious question: do you now use, or at least to some extent, even AI for that? Because now, as I think about it, uh, when let's say a tax rule has changed, now a tax expert has to read that. That tax expert also need to have very deep understanding of rippling system, that how these are implemented already, and then take a judgment that whether some changes are needed or not needed, because in some cases it might just be a configuration change. And it's a very time-taking process, zero chances of error, and you require an expert, and in a way a cross-domain expert, both in taxation and the systems.
Exactly.
And which sounds like a great contender for a smart AI agent to just be on top of it, which of course can have a human in the loop. But how are you all already experimenting with using AI for such things? If yes, that how the results have been so far?
Yeah, you actually anticipated a meeting I had yesterday afternoon with our tax platform team. So we're absolutely working on it. I'd say the models are getting there. An interesting example is maybe the Canada tax regulations. The documentation there is actually very well written, and is reasonably amenable to being turned into code, but it's still not something you can really one shot. Like there's lots of corner cases, and one of the key questions too is once you generate the code, is it accurate or not? And so there's still a need for humans to, in parallel with the AI, review the code, but also come up with test scenarios. And I think the future here is likely co-design and co-implementation and co-testing, where the AI will read the document, the human will read the document, they'll compare notes. AI will generate the first pass of the code, humans will give some input, and then AI and humans will co-design a bunch of tests as well. But absolutely something we're working on, something I'm very excited about. I think, thinking about 2030, I think the entire pipeline by which this kind of real world, rule is turned into software is going to go through a dramatic transformation. And, interesting to think about, like, how will the role of the engineer change? How will the role of the product manager change? How will the role of the subject matter expert, like a tax compliance person, change over the next few years? I imagine they're all going to come much closer together, and with the help of AI, all kind of like work the same problem at the same time. And so you also need to think through, like, what is the workflow there, right? Who's implementing, who's judging, who's testing, who's we talk about maker checker, like who's making, who's checking, like that whole software factory is about to be transformed, I think.
And to some extent, I think one of course construct is human in the loop, and then there is also this multi-agent orchestration that people are trying out now.
Exactly.
Right? That you have multiple agents, each agent play a certain role, a role of a critic, or role of the problem solver, or role of an observer, and then they keep iterating, and then eventually once this committee of agents is satisfied, then probably it goes to human. But if I further probe you on what are the most ambitious using AI for different part of businesses that you are experimenting at Rippling and can talk about, what will be the top three that, the most ambitious, Black Mirror-ish, AI solutions that are getting built?
Yeah. I mean, hopefully much more positive than the average Black Mirror episode. But I think what I'm seeing is there was kind of like maybe 2 or 3 waves of AI so far. So I think, maybe the first wave, which was not particularly interesting, was the kind of like basic chat bot where an employee would show up and ask something like, hey, how many days of time off did I take this year, right? And you saw a lot of that kind of application. It's kind of like circa 2022 ChatGPT,
which adds value but is not game changer.
Yeah, it's not a game changer. And then so that was maybe like round 1. I think what we saw with round 2 was some applications of summarization and structured and unstructured, like, document understanding. Summarization, I think one great example has been in the recruiting realm, where you're trying to summarize interview feedback, you're trying to summarize transcripts from a recorded interview. Like, that's definitely been game changing, and we've incorporated some of that into our recruiting suite, which is part of the product. And then same thing on the spend management side. You're doing receipt scanning or other kind of like document analysis in a procurement context. So I think that's been kind of wave 2, and then I think wave 3 is really a AI assistant or an agentic interface to the entire platform, and that's something we're very actively working on with teams both in the US and actually a big team in Bangalore as well that spun up over the last year. And so there it's really about harnessing some of the advances in the coding agents to navigate the entire platform, and essentially creating this agent that is able to analyze data inside of Rippling. The key use case there is helping an admin figure out something about the company, and it's frequently not just a report, right? It's like you want to create a report, you want to run the report, you want to do some further analysis, you want to run a second report, you want to further interpret the results, and so we've gone through a number of iterations on kind of like agent orchestration there, but something we're really excited about is just harnessing the coding agents like in the Rippling context with access to Rippling specific tools. And so that's the main thing we're focused on right now. And I think you're going to see that across a whole slew of products, especially any kind of product that is a core system of record for some kind of business data. And I think Rippling is a pretty compelling system of record. Like, I think those tools are going to come into those platforms, and many of the things you can do with a Claude code or an open code or whatever, as a developer, like really like any employee, I think is going to expect very similar capabilities. You can kind of see it right now with Anthropic launching co-work as well. Like, they're really bringing the Claude code experience to
There's
everyone.
Claude bot that went
Yeah.
back,
Maltbot, OpenClaw. It's honestly hard to keep track with all the name changes, but I think that is the expectation that I see shifting right now. Is people have seen the power of these agentic tools in the software development realm. And the question is, hey, why can't I just apply that to any kind of business software or business data analysis? And so, big focus for us is bringing that capability into the platform.
Right. With the evolving times and as much we work with various frontier research labs, most of the labs are putting a lot of effort in making these agents very efficient at using enterprise tools itself, because that is where the big economic value unlock would happen. Are you all already planning about that? Till date, for example, or till some time back, Rippling as an interface was supposed to be used just by humans. But probably soon we will have a time where the very much Rippling interface would be used by agents instead.
Exactly.
Right. And in that shift, do you need to change anything in your application itself, or do you think rather just agents will adapt to what exists? Like a little bit like SEO, for example. While initially websites were built to be consumed by humans, but then eventually everyone realized that all the crawler bots need to consume it right away, and then entire SEO optimization came in. What do you foresee as SEO equivalence of an enterprise software in future?
Yeah, I think it is kind of hard to predict how quickly computer use and browser use by these tools is going to get better, right? And so we've had discussions internally and just with like friends and folks in my network, right? On the one hand, you could bet on browser use, computer use getting so good so fast that you don't need to build special AI or agentic interfaces. On the other hand, I think the browser still adds a lot of overhead when it comes to accessing data, extracting data, manipulating data. So I'm generally quite bullish on a set of tools or APIs largely geared towards agentic use, right?
So through MCP more
I think MCP
or just the API.
Or honestly, it's like I think there's like interesting questions about like, hey, is MCP exactly the right standard or not? just thinking about coding agents, for example, for a second, they're actually very successful at using CLI tools, right? Thinking about my last 24 hours, I was using, like open code with the GitHub CLI to do a bunch of analysis of a build failure. Like that kind of thing is actually very powerful.
Yeah.
And so you don't necessarily even need to expose an MCP interface. You can make a very straightforward REST API or a very straightforward CLI and give the agent access to that. My sense is that probably has more legs than sitting back and hoping that computer use gets really good. I think especially for any kind of data intensive application, there's still something to be said for stripping away the unnecessary HTML and stripping away the unnecessary JSON and bringing some of the traditional like big data processing stack to bear directly on the data, managed by an agent. And so in that sense, I don't know that, enterprise software APIs are going out of fashion, anytime soon, but maybe some of how they are documented, you think about, open API schemas and, I know there's a bunch of like emerging, like it's kind of like data catalog or like schema description standards geared towards enabling AI tools to make sense of the data. I see a lot of that coming the way of the enterprise tools, like making it easier for AI to find their way. But I think likely the browser stays around. It's mostly used by humans. It's maybe used by a few AIs, but the AI agent hits something that looks like an API or a CLI to do a lot of work.
So the two camps, one is the computer use getting better and then just agents being able to just use what humans use. And of course, as you rightly said, it has its own complexities. While of course all the AI labs are trying their best to figure it out. The other camp is, the APIs and or CLI, etc., fulfilling agents' needs. Here, however, the flip side would be that this could only work if the documentation associated with the APIs and CLI is really rich. And at Rippling, you would say that as of today, your inclination is little more about enhancing the documentation to make sure that the CLI or API interfaces can be easily consumed by the AI agents, rather than trying to figure out that how would CU use mature up.
Exactly. Yeah. One other thing I'll say though, to the point of like solving real world problems, thinking about our interactions with some of the tax agencies, like the most modern ones have APIs that they're kind of like in the same camp we are, but there is a lot of older software where you're interacting with a tax agency. They have a website built in the early 2000s. You need to go into that portal and extract some data. I'm very bullish long term on computer use in that context, where realistically some of that software is not getting fixed or is not getting an API anytime soon. And so I think while I think for us API CLIs is probably the path forward, when it comes to getting products like Rippling to do this last mile work in the real world, like their computer use or browser use seems like a very fruitful capability. So excited about
I kind
that.
of agree that on a longer enough horizon, I think it's the real answer would be that both are going to exist, because the long tail of a lot of business softwares probably might never have that matured API, CLI, and documentation, and hence by that time most likely the curve on CU, the evals, etc., will get at least at 90%, if not 100%.
Exactly.
While on the other hand, I think the more mature, widespread platforms, of course, you cut all the fat associated with HTML, etc., and directly work with the APIs. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's this question of are you moving the compute to the data, or is the data moving to the compute, right? And like how expensive is the movement, right? And so I think with APIs and CLIs, you are minimizing the amount of data that's moving around. You're leaving some of the processing to the systems that are very close to the data, and then the AI tools are extracting the key bits. It will likely be very expensive to blanket extract massive amounts of data trying to get an agent to make sense of it. That's never going to be free. And so moving some of the computation to the data is I think generally the right strategy.
Makes sense. So, Albert, we would love to double click on your long journey in tech, right? As you were talking earlier, that during your university days, you did bunch of internship, gave you great exposure, then you worked at, I think, some companies which handle the largest scale in the world, Cloudflare, etc., right? So first tell us how you grew as the engineer that you are today,
Yes.
uh, and then I'll probe you on what were the learnings and changes in the journey that you have seen.
Yeah. I mean, going all the way back, so grew up in South Africa, roughly in the era of, John T. Rhodes, Javagal Srinath, Anil Kumble.
Oh, wow.
Those were
So
my,
you are a cricket fan too.
yeah, yeah. I watch less cricket these days, living in the US, but,
Yeah.
I remember that era fondly. So, grew up there and, a lot of my early career in South Africa, and then moved to
John
the
T. Rhodes, every Indian loves John T. Rhodes.
yeah, I understand. I didn't actually follow him that closely for a while, but I understand he's become a big
Yeah,
celebrity over here.
yeah.
So that's great to see. So yeah, I mean, early career in South Africa, a lot of internships, as I mentioned, and I think I was really fortunate, through that work, and some of this during high school and university time as well, to have some time to really kind of like go deep on operating systems, networking, that kind of thing. I fondly remember, compiling Linux kernels from scratch in the late 90s, and to some extent, some of the excitement around, like AI tools and AI coding right now reminds me of the excitement I had when I was downloading a fresh, like, Linux kernel release in the late 90s. It's the same kind of like energy in the community right now. Or, when Ruby on Rails came out,
yes.
no one's sleeping because they're building stuff with Ruby on Rails. So, a lot of my early career spent doing that stuff. And I think it's actually really helped me, in my later career, as I, work with 1,000 engineers, like having that like deep grounding in, some of these like key like systems design principles to critique, the work the team is doing, to think about our long-term technology strategy, that kind of thing. I'm like really thankful for those internships and the time at university where I could go deep on those systems to understand the fundamentals.
Right.
And then, so from there, moved to the US in 2013 to join Cloudflare, big CDN network provider, and I mean, becoming a pretty popular developer platform now too. Some of that stuff was only just starting while I was there. They were about 50 people when I joined. I was a data team of one.
Oh, wow.
I remember showing up and Cloudflare's data stack at the time was 5 servers in a Portland data center that didn't boot. And they were like, welcome to the company, Albert. We need a data pipeline. And so, got to start really from scratch there. And I think generally I really, again, reflect fondly on that opportunity and those learnings. I think joining these like earlier stage companies, these startups, where it's greenfield, nothing is figured out. There's nobody to your left or your right that can tell you how to do things.
Right.
Like that is how you learn the fastest.
Right.
And so I think I was very fortunate, at Cloudflare and a few companies before that, and also after that at Segment, to be put into that position over and over, because that's really how I think I was able to accelerate my learning, is by not doing work inside of a well-established system and needing to figure things out from first principles. So a couple of years at Cloudflare building the data team, joined Segment in 2017, and so there we were a customer data platform, essentially collecting events about how users are interacting with various products. Funnily enough, Hotstar was actually a Segment customer for a short period as they were building their own data pipelines, and so we had a very fun year where Hotstar was on the Segment platform, and I had to teach the entire team in the US about what the IPL was, so that they could understand the massive surges of data that we were experiencing in the middle of these T20 games. And so that was a very fun period. And actually that pressure from the hot start traffic, forced us to do a bunch of, foundational work on the segment architecture. And then, that team went on to build their own system, which was obviously super impressive. And I would guess has, scaled 10x or 100x since. But that was my fun turn in the hot star IPL realm. And I think really the shift for me from Cloudflare to Segment was, into this role as a manager of managers, thinking a lot more about, the team, recruiting, that kind of thing. And then 4 years at Segment, then we got acquired by Twilio mid-pandemic, and then I was at Twilio for 18 months and then joined Rippling in 2022. And so been there since. And, I think reflecting also on that journey, it's been this interesting shift from these like big data systems. I joke that a lot of my career was moving, JSON bytes from point A to point B. So that was like Cloudflare and Segment. And
then the complexity of scale.
Yeah, it's absolutely the complexity of scale. And I thinking about it in the India context, I think so many like Indian companies solving problems for users in India. They look like those kinds of challenges, right? There's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users, lots of bytes, lots of network. So a lot of my work at Cloudflare and Segment looked like that. And then Rippling was an interesting transition. Over the last like 3 years, Rippling has also become a large data platform under the covers, but it added this complexity of, kind of like a complex business domain, lots of rules, lots of changes in, business logic that needs to be encoded, software that's quite challenging to test. It's like there's front end, there's back end, there's a whole bunch of interactions between these things. There's customers with lots of real-time constraints, getting people paid on time, lots of other regulatory considerations as well. So it's been a very different kind of software engineering to what I did before at Cloudflare and Segment. And so I think, again, feel very fortunate that I've been exposed to this kind of problem, because there's kind of like, I don't know exactly what to call it, but like business domain heavy software engineering is its own discipline, its own challenge. And so I really enjoyed that.
So if I see the contrast, say, from your Cloudflare days to Rippling days, one, as you talked about, being 1% data team, right? And a lot of freedom, almost greenfield. You have to build things from scratch. And as which you rightly said, that gives and creates an opportunity to discover and learn a lot of new things, be on accelerated learning curve. Versus Rippling, where when you joined, the company probably would have existed for 6, 7, 8 years already. Lot of code built already, certain design choices taken already. And second is also, at least in my head, work at Cloudflare is little more like a computer scientist, because you are little far from a lot of messy rules and regulations and UI. But you probably, in a layman term, it might just seem like moving one JSON from a place to another. But then you are solving the computer science problems.
Yes.
That how do you handle scale? How do you, handle the peak spikes and the curves in the most efficient way? Versus Rippling, where, of course, these problems would remain, but at the same time, you also have to really figure out the abstractions for all the messy business logic that exist. How was this transition? And that I would also kind of link it to also parallel it with AI, right? Just like humans, I think even for AI, building an application from scratch is much easier. But then how do you see using AI to add value to this 10 million line of code base that already exists, that developed over 10 years? Because that is one thing that most CTOs even today struggle with. That sure, my team can use AI to build a new thing, new page or new application from scratch, but I really need it to create a value in my existing code base.
Yes.
So how do you tackle these problems, both as an individual, and how do you get AI to add value in this complex context?
Yeah, no, it's I remember many years ago I interviewed an engineer, and I was kind of asking him a question along the lines of like, what do you enjoy? And he said there's kind of two kinds of work in the world. There's greenfield development and there's brownfield remediation. And I am a brownfield remediation guy.
Very
And I was like,
interesting.
wow, I
Wow.
will remember the phrase
Yeah.
brownfield remediation
Yeah.
for the rest of my life. So um, I think rippling actually has a nice balance of both, right? So the with 1,100 engineers, like probably a good like 20-30% of that team is still working on what I would call very much like 0 to 1 products, like new product development. But there's a big chunk of the team geared towards supporting the existing systems, right? And to some extent, a lot of those challenges are challenges of scale, challenges of the real world evolving and needing to evolve the systems with it. But a nice balance of both. It has been interesting to think about, like, how do you apply AI to the established products. I think a couple of things have emerged. I think one is especially with new members on the team, it is suddenly much easier to understand the architecture of existing systems. And so, what you see now, and also for me personally, as I, navigate the challenge of, bouncing from product to product and problem to problem across the system, just like getting context on what's going on, what are the main elements of the data model, or what are the main elements of the code. AI has been very helpful to understand existing systems, which I think is a big
It's a big
change
leap,
from,
yeah.
2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
So just like being able to get up to speed faster has been one
I think this
nice
is a very
advance.
profound one because I see most people, at least in their 0 to 1 phase of using these AI tools, they see these tools as a way to generate new code.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you can use a Claude code just to understand the existing code better.
Precisely.
And
Yeah.
instead of having to read through thousands of lines of code, you could just ask Claude Code to summarize it to you and ask cross questions. And yeah.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I think that's maybe something underappreciated generally, is like these models as readers and these models as writers. Like they're actually very good readers as much as they are very fast writers of code. So I think that's been one thing. Like another big focus for us, taking, I think our Python code base, we have as we discussed earlier, like a relatively monolithic tech stack. So a lot of Python code, some Go code, like largely on the back end, and then the whole like front end is React TypeScript. Like the other key thing has been just like getting the code or getting tools to interact with this code in a productive way. Like once you get to 20 million lines, you have to think a lot about how is the code indexed, when it comes to a language like Python, like how do you add type annotations to the code. There we've partnered with a company called Astral that's building some very exciting tooling for Python to make it easier for humans, IDEs, and AI tools to navigate this code base. So like a lot of the work in wrestling with this code is just like, are the tools fast, or can you efficiently find your way around? Because if a human can do it, then an AI can do it. And a lot of this brownfield work is orienting yourself in the code, making sometimes a big change, but also sometimes a small surgical change, and then quickly testing it. And so a lot of our work over the last couple of years has been making sure we modularize the code base, looking at things like service startup time, test startup time, and candidly we still have work to do there. Like this code base doesn't sleep, and every time I talk to the team, we've added another 10,000 tests, and we've added another couple of million lines of code. And so as much as we're making the tools better, we're like not always gaining on the problem because so much new code is getting written. But yeah, I think that's where I really see these AI tools helping too, is like wrangling that code,
To pick one specific
getting
point
things
that you
built.
mentioned, that do you also feel that in order to leverage these AI tooling for software development better, the existing code repo itself have to evolve a bit? Um, and the second question is that you talked about using these agents as good reader, and second is not expecting that my existing 10 million or 20 million line of code could work with this AI tooling as is, but
Exactly.
then you have to plan a certain transition of that repo itself so that these agents can work more efficiently with them. How do you measure? So, another, I think, pertinent question that most tech leaders today grapple with, that sure, we have got a lot of AI tooling tools and people use it as well. So, of course, the first hurdle is driving the adoption. But even post driving the adoption, what metric do I measure to be objectively confident that the productivity of the tech team is now higher?
Mm.
Now, there could be extremely bad metric for it and good. I remember someone saying that one simple metric could be just the number of lines of code produced. But that's a very dangerous metric to be looking at,
Absolutely.
because then you can just fill it with slop and not really have value for the business. How do you measure that, whether, let's say, if I talk about end of 2024 versus end of 2025, how do you measure whether productivity of 1,000 plus engine tech team at tripling now is more productive versus not? So what is your objective measure, and what do you do to drive
Yeah.
that?
I think some of it is objective and some of it is, subjective, or
Quali-
I would call it like anecdata, right?
Anecdote,
And so I think right now it is important to have a good mix of both, right? Ultimately, probably the key thing I look at is just like number of pull requests merged over a given, week, month, quarter, year. A secondary metric has just been like the size of the pull requests, and so I've seen our like number tick up, and I've seen the size tick up a little bit. Now, as you said, this can cut many ways. Like, on the one hand, you have to be careful of AI slop. On the other hand, team might be writing more tests now because it's easier to add tests. I think it's important not to over-index too much
Right.
on
So these could
those
be
things.
indicators, but not the
Yeah,
key
it's
goal.
indicators, but I think you have to be careful with how you run the team, and you get what you incentivize. And so if there's some Dilbert cartoons about this, where Wally jokes about they come up with some metric and he's like, hey, I'm gonna go code me a new minivan this afternoon. So you have to be very careful here. I think ultimately the thing we really look at is maybe less a code metric and more just output of the team in terms of successful product delivery. And so we have a quarterly planning process, and a key part of that process is reviewing, like, did the team get done what they said they would get done? And you see high performing teams, I don't know, it's like 70, depending if you think about OKRs or how you measure this stuff, it's like they get a 0.7, or they ship like 80-90% of their plan. Like, that is actually the best indication I've found that things are good, because also especially in our business, like, it's not just about the code. It's like, can you successfully support the product in production? What are the trends in number of customer support tickets? Is that going in the right direction? Again, you have to be careful about counting incidents, but like, what is the incident trend? Is the team maybe having fewer low severity incidents versus like more high severity incidents? So you kind of need to form a holistic picture across all of that stuff. But like, say, I would summarize it as, is the team successfully shipping reliably quarter over quarter the things they plan to ship? And so mainly look at that. And then when you see that not going to plan, like the team is not delivering as you would like, then you can go and dig into all of these other secondary metrics.
More of input metrics.
Yeah, more of the input metrics, and then you can ask a bunch of questions, right? But I think you have to be very careful not to make an input metric your output metric, because then weird stuff happens. Then Dilbert happens. It's like.
So, Albert, we talked about evolution of the tech landscape overall as AI becomes a major player in this. If I now cut it a bit geographically, that within tech there are multiple sub-segments. There's product, there is infra engineering, there is application engineering, there's platform engineering, and various other cuts, right? And now, given you already have a fairly large tech team in India, close to 400, 500, if I guess correctly, what are the sub-segments where you see India as a very solid talent base, where your team is able to find really high quality talent, and often in good volumes, versus what are the talent areas where your bottleneck is just availability of talent here in India? Uh, and what is your rationale why so, and how India could fix that wherever we
Yeah.
are lacking currently?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about my experience both, at Segment and Rippling, and what happened at Segment is we were acquired by Twilio, and Twilio had, kind of like early in the pandemic, actually opened a Bangalore office, and so post acquisition, Segment started building out a Bangalore team, and then obviously moved to Rippling, and here we had a Bangalore office since the founding of the company, so many years before I joined. So that's kind of like my two data points. I think I have generally been firstly very impressed with the quality of like core infrastructure talent, thinking both about teams at Twilio and Rippling. My guess there is that these mega kind of like mega companies, mega products, thinking of the Flipkarts, the Hotstars of the world, like they're really a breeding ground for top infra talent. It's really,
And just the sheer scale
yeah,
of
sheer
India,
scale,
right?
the sheer number of
Yeah.
bytes or JSON that has to move from point A to B, or the video or whatever.
Right.
Like I think I've been really impressed with the talent we can access on that front. Also incredibly impressed with just like what I would call like product engineers. Thinking about the Rippling team, there are amazing engineers here. They're likely world-leading experts in like U.S. Tax legislation. Like you wouldn't imagine it as you walk down the streets of Bangalore that there goes a software engineer that knows more about U.S. taxes than almost anyone. Like really impressed with folks at that level in the stack too.
Right.
And then I think the two areas where I think the talent is out there, but it's been harder to find, is somewhere between the product engineering or application engineering layer and this like lower level like database core compute layer. There's this kind of like middle platform layer. In the Rippling context, I think about systems like the permission system, some of the reports and dashboard capabilities, some of the back end technology powering that stuff. This kind of like middleware platform, like there, I think we're certainly looking very hard, but it's been harder to find lots of engineers with experience in that realm. They're either low in the stack or high in the stack, but like a bit of a gap in the middle.
Right.
And then probably the other like key area, where again we're actively looking, but where I think there's less experience in the market, is with product managers and designers that have what I would consider like enterprise B2B experience, like really impressive folks, coming out of the B2C realm. Again, you have these like
Of course,
massive applications with
Hotstar,
hundreds of millions of users.
Yeah.
But less folks with B2B experience. I think also like less folks that have seen what these solutions look like or need to look like in the US, in Europe, etc. And so I think as the world gets despite the political climate, I think the world is still getting smaller. My hope is as the world gets smaller, you're going to see more Indian companies serve a global audience. You're going to see more early in career engineers and product managers take on these like global challenges. And we would certainly love to hire some of those folks. But it's kind of like the two areas where I wish we had.
So you're bottlenecked on the
Yeah,
availability of talent.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the platform engineering side and on the UX and product side.
UX and product side. Yeah. I think we would grow our Bangalore presence even faster than we have if we could find even more of those folks. And so that's been a bottleneck.
And if I further probe you, and before we wrap up our session, that at Rippling, how do you see your Indian talent base expanding in next few years? What are the kind of people that your team really wants to be part of the team? And cutting across the stack, right? We talked about your internship program earlier, and then at the middle level and at the leadership level. What are the kind of people that you really want to come and join your team?
Yeah. I mean, we are, really like hiring at all levels and all positions. So as we said earlier, we're expanding the intern program. We're hiring, early in career folks, couple of years of experience. We continue to look for senior staff and principal engineers. Especially folks that are excited to come in and own a key product area from a technical perspective. Actively hiring on the product team as well. I would guess actually that the team in India might grow faster than the team in the US. To give you a sense right now, it's probably like, I guess like 55% US, 35% India, and then like 10% like Canada, Australia, and team in Europe.
Right.
I would not be surprised if the US and the Bangalore office are roughly equal sized. Go up to like 45, 10 miscellaneous.
Right.
So I think we will hire as many folks as we can find here. And again, like the thing really driving that is, I think, just the quality of the product engineering and the kind of like infrastructure engineering we can do here. Like, really impressed with the team. Every time I visit, I was like blown away by these excited groups of engineers like whiteboarding in the conference rooms. As Parker likes to say, they're like literally fogging up the glass as they design and build software. So like really cool, and something we want to keep investing in.
No, fantastic. Looking forward to India team of Rippling contributing more and more.
Yeah.
And at Scaler, we hope that we can contribute to that to the best through various talent sources that we build. So that was Albert for you all. Thank you so much, Albert, for
Of course, thank you for having me.
sharing such deep insights and your journey. I'm sure this was valuable for all our audience. And of course, Rippling is hiring. So all the fantastic engineers, product managers, user experience designers who are watching this podcast, check out Rippling.
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.